Welcome back. After a decades-long fight to legalize marijuana, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a federal cannabis legalization bill known as the MORE Act. Joining me now to discuss how this bill will affect New Yorkers is Maritza Perez, Director of the Office of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So the U.S. House of Representatives passed the MORE Act. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Of course, yeah. So this will mark the second time that the House of Representatives passed this comprehensive bill. The MORE Act would deschedule marijuana, so that means completely removing it from the list of controlled substances. It would also expunge and resentence federal marijuana convictions. It would reinvest marijuana tax revenue back into communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs to provide things like expungement services, other legal services, job training, social support, whatever the community might need. And it also devotes some funding to small business administration programs so that individuals who have been impacted by prohibition can join the flourishing cannabis industry if they choose to. And finally, it would end collateral consequences for marijuana activity. In other words, individuals would no longer be denied federal benefits for marijuana convictions.
So I know the bill would end the federal ban, but leave legalization up to the states. Can you just explain what this means and what is the difference for those who don't understand the difference between those two things?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So, federal marijuana prohibition has really put a damper on states progressing in their own marijuana programs. When we talk about removing marijuana from the list of the Controlled Substances Act, from the list of controlled substances, that's what we mean by saying that we're descheduling marijuana, that we're ending federal prohibition. So ending federal prohibition is huge because it does allow the states to implement their own programs if they choose to do that. But it also means that people will no longer face federal criminal penalties for marijuana activity. It means that non-citizens could no longer be deported for marijuana activity. It means that veterans can access medical marijuana should they want to. It would also mean that finally we can continue to really study marijuana. It would expand access to research by removing it from Schedule 1.
So the legalization of marijuana was a long time battle, especially here in New York City. Why did it take so long to get to this point?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. First, we have to remember that the drug war is very entrenched in this country. I think to really dismantle the war on drugs, which marijuana is just a tiny piece of, we really need to see a cultural shift. But I think something that was unique about New York was that New York really wanted to make sure that people who are most harmed by prohibition were incorporated in the law, were part of building out the new law, which is why I think it took a while to get it right. But it's important. It is important that in any marijuana legislation, whether at the state or federal level, it's important that it center people who have been most impacted by prohibition.
Now, according to Forbes, the marijuana industry generated $25 billion in sales last year and is expected to hit $65 billion by 2030. Could this actually be a positive outcome for our current economy?
Yes, absolutely. All of the dollars being generated by the marijuana industry could certainly help the economy, especially if we use the dollars in the right way. At the Drug Policy Alliance, we believe that these funds should be used to invest in communities and people who have been most devastated by marijuana prohibition. They should be used for things like expungements, job training, expanding social services. In fact, a report put out by Supernova Women, which is a great advocacy group in the marijuana space, shows that for every dollar invested in social equity, folks will see a huge return on investment, up to $4 of return on investment. So we should definitely be reinvesting those tax dollars and that revenue.
So, in that same article by Forbes, people against the bill fear that this will increase hard drug use and violence amongst drug dealers. Is this a legitimate fear to have?
I don't believe so. What we know and what study after study shows us is that places with legal recreational marijuana programs do not see an uptick in drug use. What you may see is an uptick in safe drug use because regulation means that people know exactly what they're consuming, what they're putting in their bodies. Also, we know that conditions for violence are created by drug prohibition. People competing for customers, for territory. Legal marijuana markets will mean that illicit marijuana will no longer be as profitable.
Thank you so much for actually like pointing that out because I never thought of it that way before. The way you pointed out kind of makes it a little bit clearer for me. So thanks for that. Now, many have categorized the war on drugs and the legalization of marijuana as a racial justice issue. How has this issue of marijuana affected Black and Latin communities?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We know that race infiltrates every part of the criminal justice system, meaning that people are exposed to severe racial disparities in our criminal legal system. And this disproportionately falls on the shoulders of Black and Brown people. We know, for example, that Black Americans are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug related offenses than their white counterparts, despite equal substance use rates. We also know that in the marijuana field, that they're nearly 4 times more likely to be incarcerated for marijuana offenses than white people because of racist policing, despite equal usage rates. In the immigration space, we know that marijuana activity and marijuana crimes continue to be a leading cause of deportation to the state. And this is true of, even individuals who are partaking in medical marijuana programs in compliance with state law, or people who are complying with their recreational program. So another reason we really need to end federal prohibition.
If this bill is put into law, what would this mean for communities who face the brunt of the law enforcement?
If this bill became law, there is a reparative justice component to the bill. This bill emphasizes that there needs to be federal resentencing of marijuana convictions, but there also needs to be state and federal expungement of marijuana convictions. I talked about the Community Reinvestment Fund. That means reinvesting tax dollars and marijuana revenue back into communities most harmed by prohibition. And then, of course, there's funding for Small Business Administration grant programs for people who have been most impacted. We would also end the collateral consequences of partaking in the marijuana industry or using marijuana even legally. Basically, what all of this means is that people would be able to move on with their lives, to live healthful, productive lives, which we think would actually empower people, empower communities.
And I just want to clarify, is that actually part of the MORE Act right now?
It is, yes.
Okay, that's wonderful because I was worried that it may not have been, and I think that although this is like a really great step in the right direction, you have to address a lot of the trauma that it's brought to those communities. And speaking of that, I kind of want to talk about that a little bit more. I think that a lot of Black and Brown communities have faced trauma, and not just for adults, also for teenagers who kind of were victims of this as well. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, we know that the drug war, including marijuana is definitely a component of the drug war, has had definitely a tremendous impact in the lives of people. If you think about just a simple, interaction with police, can lead to something traumatic. It can lead to an arrest. It can lead to jail time. It could even lead to prison time, which means separation from your loved ones, which means losing the ability to feed your family. It might even mean the ability to be able to keep your children and family together. It could mean that when you leave, you might not be able to vote to fully reintegrate back into society. So definitely we know that people suffer tremendous consequences due to marijuana prohibition.
And do you think the law should also clear records of marijuana convictions just in general?
Yes, marijuana convictions need to be cleared, both at the federal and the state level. Most marijuana convictions and arrests happen at the state level, so I would hope that any federal effort supports state level expungement.
Now, I'm thinking about this from a racial standpoint. I know some people have gotten really, really rich and really successful from this industry, and we still see a lot of our neighbors, I guess, here in the Bronx or just other communities of color, not reap those same benefits. What do you think about just that situation in general?
Yeah, I think it's a very enraging situation. We know that the legal marijuana industry is comprised of majority white men. Yet, if you look at who is still being arrested and convicted for marijuana crimes, it's largely Black and Brown people who are going to jail, who are spending time in prison, who are even being deported because of marijuana activity. It is a very enraging thing, which is why Congress needs to act now. They should have acted yesterday.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and I just want to talk about the fact that um, law enforcement was used a lot to just address issues of drug use. But can we talk about how it's important to just treat drug use as a health problem and not a criminal justice issue?
Yeah, so the truth of the matter is, in the US, more people are arrested for drug possession than for any other offense in this country, with one arrest for drug possession happening every 23 seconds, which means every 23 seconds, a person's life is turned upside down for simply possessing drugs. We know that interaction with the criminal legal system exasperates social problems, and it certainly makes life more difficult for people who use drugs and people who may be experiencing substance use disorder. It creates conditions that drive people to problematic drug use and destabilizes their lives. We also know that people with substance use disorder are more likely to overdose when leaving jail or prison. This is the population that actually really fills our jails and prisons. What we're saying is that individuals need access to health services, not handcuffs. Treating drug use through a public health lens instead of a criminal legal one is not just a logical thing to do, but we believe it's a compassionate, moral, courageous thing to do.
So before we wrap, can you just let everyone know how they can stay up to date with your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Folks should follow us on drugpolicy.org. We're on Instagram and Twitter, but sign up for our newsletters on drugpolicy.org to keep up with all of our work. Thank you.
All right, Maritza, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to have joined you. Thank you.
That's all for our show today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.